Not all avoidants are the same. This matters more than it might initially seem, because the advice, the frameworks, the psychological portraits that get applied to avoidant attachment tend to treat it as a monolithic thing, a single pattern with a single origin producing a single set of behaviors. And that flattening, however useful as a starting point, misses something important. The person who goes cold without warning is not the same as the person who stays present but emotionally unreachable. The person who sabotages relationships at the point of genuine commitment is not the same as the person who was never fully in to begin with. The person who dismisses their own emotional needs is not the same as the person who is dimly aware of those needs and terrified by them. Same attachment style, genuinely different interior experiences, different origins, different behavioral expressions, different things that reach them and different things that don't. Understanding which type you are or which type the person you loved is changes the entire picture. How the types form. Before the types themselves, something about how avoidant attachment develops in different ways. The core of avoidant attachment is consistent across all types, an early environment in which emotional needs were not reliably met, in which the expression of those needs was met with dismissal, irritation, or absence, and in which the adaptive response was to suppress the needs. To become self-sufficient, to learn that the interior, its wants, its fears, its genuine experience of distress was safer when kept private. But early environments vary significantly in their specific texture, and the specific texture of the environment shapes the specific flavor of the avoidance that develops in response. Some avoidants grew up with parents who were consistently emotionally unavailable, not cruel, not abusive, simply absent in the emotional register. The warmth was present in the functional sense, needs were met, care was expressed through provision, but the attunement was consistently missing. These children learned to exist in the emotional register alone. Others grew up with parents whose emotional availability was unpredictable, sometimes present, sometimes absent, sometimes overwhelming. These children learned a different lesson, not simply that emotional needs were unsafe, but that the emotional environment itself was unreliable and required constant monitoring. Others grew up with parents who actively dismissed emotional expression, who communicated, explicitly or through consistent behavior, that feelings were inconvenient, excessive, or evidence of weakness. These children learn not only to suppress their needs, but to feel something like contempt for the having of them. And others grew up in environments that appeared fine, functional, loving, stable, but where a subtle but consistent message was communicated. Your full presence, your genuine emotional reality, is more than we can comfortably hold. These children learn to shrink, to offer a reduced version of themselves that fit more comfortably within the available space. These different origins produce the four distinct types. Type 1, the dismissive. This is the type most commonly associated with avoidant attachment in popular understanding. The person who genuinely appears not to need much from relationships, who values independence as a lived reality rather than as a performed identity, who finds extended emotional intimacy genuinely draining rather than nourishing. The dismissive avoidant self-sufficiency is not entirely performance. It is a developed capacity, a genuine skill at regulating emotional experience internally that was built through years of having no other option. They learn to provide for themselves what others provide for each other, and the learning was thorough enough that the external provision genuinely feels unnecessary much of the time. What distinguishes the dismissive type is the degree to which the emotional needs have been not just suppressed but genuinely devalued. Other avoidant types suppress their needs while being dimly or acutely aware of their existence. The dismissive avoidant has gone further, has incorporated the dismissal of emotional need into their identity and their worldview. They genuinely believe at some level that needing people is weakness, that the most admirable version of a human life is the most self-contained one. This belief was not chosen. It was installed by an environment that consistently communicated through neglect, through the modeling of emotional self-sufficiency, through the implicit or explicit message that dependence was not respected, that the correct way to be was alone in one's interior. The dismissive avoidant in relationship can be genuinely warm, can be loyal, consistent, thoughtful in the practical ways. What they struggle with is the specific quality of emotional presence, the being with someone in their feeling rather than the doing for them in their situation. The intimacy that requires them to be in the interior with another person, which requires them to be in their own interior, which is the place the entire architecture was built to avoid. They tend to leave relationships not dramatically, but through gradual withdrawal. Through the slow reduction of emotional investment that looks from the outside like cooling interest and is from the inside the system returning to its preferred baseline. What reaches them is not emotional intensity, not declarations, not the depth of another person's feeling demonstrated through the force of its expression. What reaches them is the quality of someone else's self-possession. Someone who does not need them to fill an emotional role, someone whose independence is as genuine as theirs. In the presence of that person, the cost calculation changes. The intimacy stops feeling like a demand on resources they have elected to keep for themselves. Type 2, the fearful. This type carries a more visible internal conflict than the dismissive. Where the dismissive avoidant has largely resolved the tension between wanting connection and fearing it by suppressing the wanting, the fearful avoidant has not resolved the tension. Lives in it. They want closeness, genuinely, acutely, in ways that are sometimes as intense as anxious attachment. But the wanting is accompanied by a fear that is equally genuine and equally intense, the fear that closeness will produce exactly the hurt that the attachment wound is built around. That intimacy will lead to being left, being overwhelmed, being consumed, or being seen and found insufficient. The fearful avoidance behavioral pattern is consequently more volatile than the dismissive's. They move toward connection, and then, as the connection deepens and the fear activates, they move away, sometimes rapidly, sometimes in ways that are confusing to the people who experience the shift without understanding its origin. The fearful type often appears anxious in early stages of connection, pursuing, reaching, genuinely invested. And then, as the stakes become real, the avoidant pattern asserts itself. The withdrawal that follows the pursuit is particularly disorienting to partners because it seems to contradict everything that came before. The origin of fearful avoidant attachment is typically an early environment with more volatility than the dismissive types. A caregiver who is sometimes genuinely loving and sometimes genuinely frightening or rejecting. An attachment environment where the person who was supposed to be the source of safety was also sometimes the source of threat. This produces the fundamental conflict. The need for connection is real because it was sometimes met, and the fear of connection is real because it was sometimes violated. What reaches the fearful avoidant is patience that is not passive, the specific quality of someone who can hold steady through the push-pull without being destabilized by it and without withdrawing in response to it, not because they will eventually wear the avoidant down through endurance, but because the specific, consistent quality of someone who is not frightened by the volatility communicates, over time, something the fearful avoidant's nervous system has not previously received, that the closeness does not have to end in the way it always ended before. Type 3, the invisible. This type is the least discussed and in some ways the most difficult to recognize, including by the person who is it. The invisible avoidant did not grow up in an environment of overt emotional neglect or volatility. The environment appeared and in many functional ways was fine, loving parents, stable home, care that was genuine. But somewhere in that environment a consistent message was communicated, not through cruelty, but through the accumulated texture of daily life, that the full expression of this child's genuine interior was more than the space around them could comfortably hold. Maybe the parents were themselves emotionally contained and were simply uncomfortable with the child's intensity. Maybe there was a sibling whose needs were more visible, and the invisible avoidant learned to make themselves easier to manage by reducing their emotional footprint. Maybe the family system had a particular emotional tone that did not include room for the specific qualities this child carried, the depth, the sensitivity, the genuine complexity of their interior life. The invisible avoidant learned to shrink, not to suppress needs in the same way the dismissive type suppresses them, to offer a reduced version of themselves, pleasant, functional, easy to be around, while the fuller version remained private, hidden not because it was dangerous to express, but because there was no evidence it would fit. This type often does not identify as avoidant, does not recognize the pattern in themselves because the avoidance is not the dismissal of connection, but the offering of an insufficient version of themselves within connection. They are present, engaged, often warm and apparently available, but there is a portion of their genuine interior, the fullest, most particular, most complex portion, that is not being brought. Their partners sometimes feel, without being able to articulate it, that they are close to this person but not quite reaching them, that there is something just beyond what is being offered that would constitute genuine meeting. What reaches the invisible avoidant is specific, accurate seeing, not general warmth. The particular quality of someone who perceives the fuller version, the one that has not been offered, and responds to it with interest rather than discomfort, who makes room for the fuller version through the specific quality of their reception, who communicates without words that the parts that were learned to be hidden are exactly the parts worth knowing. Type 4, the intellectual. This type uses understanding as distance, not in the cynical sense of deliberately deploying knowledge to prevent closeness. In the genuine, often unaware sense of someone who has developed extraordinary capacity for understanding emotional experience, their own and others, while remaining, at the level of felt experience, significantly removed from it. The intellectual avoidant can describe the attachment wound accurately, can explain their own patterns with clinical precision, can identify in real time the deactivating strategies as they arise and name them correctly, and then run them anyway. Because the understanding is real and the felt experience of staying in the intimacy, the actual, embodied, fully present experience of genuine closeness, is still threatening in the way it has always been threatening. The cognitive map of the territory and the territory itself are different things. And the intellectual avoidant has become extraordinarily skilled at the map while remaining, at the level of genuine emotional landing, still somewhat defended against the territory. This type often appears highly self-aware, is often highly self-aware, is often genuinely someone who has done significant work on understanding themselves and their patterns. And that understanding is real and valuable and not to be dismissed. But understanding is not the same as integration. Knowing that you withdraw when intimacy deepens does not automatically produce the capacity to stay when the alarm fires. Knowing that the management protocol is running does not automatically produce the ability to let it run without acting on it. The intellectual avoidance specific challenge is the gap between knowing and being, between the accurate map of their interior and the actual embodied experience of inhabiting it fully. What reaches them is not more insight, not more psychological framework, not someone who can meet their intellectual understanding of the dynamic with equally sophisticated analysis. What reaches them is genuine feeling, unanalyzed, unframed, simply present, their own when they can access it, or the quality of someone else's genuine emotional presence that is so completely, unself-consciously real that the intellectual distance becomes obviously insufficient to what the moment actually contains, what all four share. Different origins, different behavioral expressions. Different things that reach them and different obstacles to being reached, but underneath all four types the same fundamental architecture. A self that learned, earlier than it should have had to learn, that its genuine interior was not entirely safe to bring into contact with the world. That some reduction, some management, some form of protection was required between the interior and the exterior. That learning was not wrong given the environment that produced it, and it is costing each type something real in the present. The dismissive, the richness of genuine interdependence, the fearful, the stability of connection that does not require constant management. The invisible, the specific relief of being fully known, the intellectual, the embodied, felt, fully landed experience of their own emotional life. These are real costs, not small ones, and they are not permanent, not fixed by the type, not sealed by the origin. They are patterns, deeply grooved, old, running automatically, but patterns. And patterns, unlike personalities, can change. Slowly, with genuine work, with the specific courage of someone who has decided to face what they have been managing around. That change is available to all four types, not guaranteed, not automatic, not produced by any external intervention, available. Through the specific, sustained, genuinely effortful work of someone who has decided that the cost of the pattern is higher than the cost of facing what the pattern was built to protect against. That work is the most important thing any of the four types can do. And recognizing which type you are, or which type the person you loved is only useful insofar as it points toward that work. Not as a category to inhabit, as a doorway into honest self-knowledge, which is where all genuine change begins. The four types of avoidant, which one are you? Continued. The four types have been named, their origins, their behavioral patterns, what reaches them, what doesn't. That portrait is accurate and worth having. What continues here is the part that sits underneath the typology. The part that is less about categorization and more about what actually changes when someone, avoidant, or the person who loved one, genuinely understands which type they are dealing with, why type matters for the person who loved them. If you loved an avoidant, understanding which type they are does something specific. It replaces the generic narrative, they couldn't love me, they didn't try, they weren't capable, with a more accurate and more useful one. Because the dismissive avoidance withdrawal looks different from the fearful avoidance, even when the behavioral outcome is similar. The invisible avoidance partial presence is a different experience than the intellectual avoidance analyzed distance. And the specific injury of each type lands differently on the person on the receiving end. The person who loved a dismissive avoidant often carries a specific wound, the wound of having felt consistently that their emotional needs were excessive, that wanting more closeness was the problem, that they were asking for something unreasonable when they were asking for genuine emotional presence. This wound is not accurate. The need for genuine emotional presence in intimate relationship is not excessive. It is basic. But the dismissive avoidant's consistent experience of emotional need as something they cannot meet, combined with the implicit communication that the need itself is the issue, installs that belief in the person receiving it. The person who loved a fearful avoidant carries a different wound, the wound of inconsistency, of having been genuinely pursued and then genuinely retreated from, of the specific confusion of someone who experienced real closeness and real withdrawal in alternating sequence and could not make the two things cohere. Who spent significant energy trying to understand which version was real, the one who pursued or the one who fled. Both versions were real. That is the honest answer to the fearful avoidance contradiction. The wanting was genuine, the fear was equally genuine. Both were operating simultaneously, and the person on the receiving end was not wrong to perceive both. They were simply in the presence of someone who had not yet resolved the conflict between them. The person who loved an invisible avoidant carries perhaps the most disorienting wound, the wound of almost, a feeling perpetually close to something that never quite arrived. Of conversations that reached a certain depth and then stopped, of intimacy that was real but somehow always incomplete, of sensing a fuller version of the person that was never quite offered. This wound has a specific quality of self-doubt because the invisible avoidant is present, is warm, is not obviously withholding in the way that other types might be. The person loving them can feel the incompleteness without being able to point to any specific behavior that produced it, can sense the withheld fullness without being able to name what is being withheld, and that inability to name it can produce the specific, corrosive doubt of someone who wonders whether they imagined the gap. They did not imagine it, the gap was real. The fuller version that was sensed and never quite received was genuinely there. The invisible avoidant was not fully bringing it, not from cruelty, not from indifference, but from the deeply established habit of offering the reduced version that seemed to fit. The person who loved an intellectual avoidant carries the specific wound of proximity without landing, of being understood without being felt, of having their experience analyzed rather than met, of conversations that were insightful and sometimes revelatory and somehow, underneath all the accurate understanding, not quite touching the place that needed to be touched, because understanding is not the same as presence. And the intellectual avoidant, for all their genuine capacity for understanding, was not always fully present in the felt sense, was mapping the territory rather than inhabiting it, and the person on the receiving end felt the difference between being understood and being met, even when they could not articulate what distinguished one from the other. Why type matters for the avoidant themselves. If you are the avoidant reading this, and avoidants do read this material, often with the specific quality of recognition that comes from encountering an accurate description of something that has never been adequately named, understanding your type matters for a specific reason. It locates the work. The dismissive avoidance work is not primarily about understanding emotional needs. They can understand them intellectually without difficulty. The work is about allowing emotional needs to be felt without immediately converting the feeling into something more manageable. About staying in the discomfort of genuine want long enough to discover that the want does not destroy the self-sufficiency, it simply lives alongside it. The fearful avoidance work is more complex and requires more explicit support. The internal conflict between wanting and fearing is not resolved through insight. It is resolved through the accumulated experience of staying, of feeling the alarm fire and not acting on it repeatedly, until the nervous system develops enough evidence that the intimacy does not inevitably produce the wound it has always predicted. This work almost always benefits from a therapeutic relationship. Not because the fearful avoidant cannot do it alone, but because the therapeutic relationship itself provides the specific practice ground. A consistent, boundaried, reliably present relationship in which the staying can be practiced without the full stakes of a romantic relationship, making every moment of the alarm feel catastrophic. The invisible avoidance work is the most intimate and in some ways the most straightforward in its direction, if not in its execution. It is the work of bringing more of themselves, not dramatically, not in sudden wholesale disclosure of everything that has been withheld. In the small, incremental, requires courage each time practice of offering a slightly fuller version in the next available moment, of saying the thing that is actually true rather than the adjacent, easier thing, of letting the response to a question be genuinely complex rather than smoothed into something more receivable. This work is uncomfortable specifically because it requires tolerating the uncertainty of not knowing how the fuller version will be received. The invisible avoidance entire pattern was built around the protection of managing that uncertainty by never fully testing it. The work requires testing it repeatedly until there is enough evidence that the fuller version is survivable to bring, that it fits in the available space, that it is welcome rather than excessive, that the people worth being known by are capable of holding what they find. The intellectual avoidance work is perhaps the most specific and the most counterintuitive. It is the work of understanding less and feeling more. Not of abandoning the intellectual capacity, that capacity is real and valuable and not the problem, but of allowing the intellectual understanding to inform and accompany the felt experience rather than substituting for it, of being willing to be in the feeling without immediately framing it, of staying in the emotional moment long enough for it to actually land before the analysis begins. This requires a specific practice of slowing down, of noticing when the analytical response is arriving before the emotional one and making space for the emotional one to catch up, of tolerating the specific discomfort of genuine emotional experience that has not yet been organized into understanding. The question worth sitting with. For the person who loved an avoidant, knowing the type, understanding the origin, seeing the wound clearly, there is a question worth sitting with honestly. Does this understanding change what you want, not what you want from them specifically, what you want from love? Because one of the things that extended exposure to avoidant attachment can do, quietly, without announcement, is reorganize your expectations of intimacy, can make the charged, uncertain, requires decoding quality of avoidant connection feel like what depth actually is, can make the consistency and availability of secure attachment feel like the absence of intensity rather than the presence of something more sustaining. That reorganization is worth examining. Do you want the type of connection that requires this level of understanding to navigate? The level of reading and decoding and patient witness and careful calibration that the avoidant dynamic consistently requires? Or do you want something that is equally deep but less costly to maintain, where the depth expresses itself not in the intensity of navigating defended attachment, but in the genuine, growing, mutually invested knowing of two people who are both actually available? Both are real possibilities. Only one of them is sustainable in the long run without significant ongoing cost to the person who loves more openly. That is not a judgment of the avoidant. It is an honest accounting of what the different types require from the people who love them, and whether that requirement is something you are willing to sustain indefinitely, or whether the understanding of the types has clarified that what you actually want is something the avoidant dynamic, in any of its four forms, is not currently positioned to provide. That clarity, however uncomfortable, is the most useful thing this typology can offer, not a better map of someone else's interior, a clearer picture of what you actually need, and the honest recognition that you deserve to have it.